So, have you ever wondered why Russia took such an interest in expanding east, especially when there's not much there except an extremely hostile environment? And who started this conquest anyway? Well, it turns out that the Russian interest in Siberia is capitalism, but the actual conquest can mainly be attributed to one man, that man being Yermak Timofeyevich, a dirt-poor Cossack from dirt-poor nowhere. But before we get to the life and times of Yermak, we need to look at some historical context. Our story begins with the reign of Ivan the Terrible. Now, his realm is powerful, but still comparatively small, so he's interested in expanding his reach, especially into the east where valuable furs can be found. But to expand into eastern Siberia to establish control over this trade, Ivan would need to topple the Khanate of Kazan, which held the southern route into Siberia. There had been expeditions to circumnavigate the Khanate by entering Siberia from the northwest, but these proved to be failures, as to approach Siberia from that direction proved too arduous and difficult, even in the best of times. There were also other political reasons to topple the Khanate of Kazan. In 1540, Safagiray, the Khan of Kazan, invaded Muscovy, the name for the realm that would become Russia that was controlled by Ivan the Terrible, but was stopped after the Russians used Qasim Tartars to contain him, and Safa was forced back to his own borders. This reverse in the war also undermined Safa's authority at home, and a pro-Russian faction at his court gained enough power to make several attempts to seize the throne of Kazan. Eager to both overthrow the Khanate to expand into the east and support these pro-Russians, Ivan mounted an expedition to the River Volga to show his support of this faction. War was obviously brewing, but it wouldn't come for a few more years in 1552. On the 6th of June 1552, after receiving confirmation from the Nogai horde to the south of Kazan that they would stay neutral in the war, Ivan invaded the Khanate of Kazan. The siege of the Tatar capital began on the 30th of August, and here the Russians made use of battering rams, a siege tower, undermining, and 150 cannons to break the city, which fell on the 2nd of October. As you can imagine, the Russians were not kind to the city, razing its fortifications and killing most of the inhabitants. There were also many forced baptisms of the locals to Orthodox Christianity, and Ivan celebrated his victory by building several churches. After the war, the land of the Khanate of Kazan became the province of Perm, and he granted it to one Anikai Stroganoff as a financial investment, who had already begun establishing trade routes with Siberian natives and had a history of successful ventures in trade. A prize of great value to whoever could exploit it, the Perm lands were the reward the Stroganoffs sought for their long years of giving gifts and loyal service to the Tsar. They had but to ask, and Perm became theirs. Ready to reward their loyalty, Ivan the Terrible also intended to turn their genius for making fortunes in the wilderness to his treasury's advantage. But Anikai and his family are the second piece of the puzzle we need to understand where Yermak Timofeyevich comes in, so we'll discuss him in the next segment. Anikai Stroganoff was already a successful merchant by the time the Khanate of Kazan was incorporated into Russia. He owned a large salt industry after his father became a monk and all his brothers died childless, and he managed to successfully expand this business. In the early years of Ivan the Terrible's reign, he was given the right to control the trade routes prescribed for English merchants travelling from Arkhangelsk to Moscow. After this, he established trade routes with Siberian natives, and on the 4th of April 1558, 6 years after the fall of the Khanate of Kazan, Ivan the Terrible granted Grigory, one of Anikai's sons, large estates along the Kama and Chusovaya rivers, including tax income for 20 years. Most importantly though, Anikai and his family were given the right to expand into the territory along the Tobol and Irtish rivers, land that was controlled by the Khanate of Siberia. Of course they did this because the Stroganoffs at this point were a trading empire, and they wanted more control over the Siberian fur trade, most of which was controlled by the Khanate of Siberia. Bruce Lincoln, in his book The Conquest of a Continent, Siberia and the Russians, which I've already cited twice in this video, and I'm pretty sure will be my main source, has an interesting passage on the Stroganoffs and their interest in Siberia, showing how they were meddling there even before they had official permission from Ivan. The Russian conquest of Kazan had turned the attention of Anikai and his sons to the lands that later would become the Russian province of Perm. Even while the Tatars still held Kazan, Stroganoff agents had explored the territory beyond it, and had found new salt springs at Solikamsk, where the land could be tilled more easily than in the far north. In the Perm territory, from which the river transport to Moscow is more direct, the Stroganoffs could increase their salt production at lower cost, feed their workers more cheaply, and have easier access to Siberia's furs than at Solvyshygodsk. That's a horrible pronunciation, I am aware. And this brings us to the third and last bit of context we need before we can finally look at Yermak himself. While Russia and the Khanate of Kazan were hashing it out, the Khanate of Siberia had been dealing with its own issues. The Khanate of Siberia had been on pretty precarious ground due to rivalries with other clans until one Kuchum Khan came to power, a supposed descendant of Genghis Khan himself, in the 1560s. The most powerful leader in the region, Kuchum was a descendant of Genghis Khan, and ruler of one of the splintered successor states that followed the collapse of the Golden Horde. Kuchum quickly stabilised the situation and established allies among his neighbours and the Crimean Tatars in an attempt to thwart the Stroganoffs' expansion. In July of 1572, Kuchum launched his first raid on Stroganoff settlements, resulting in the deaths of around 100 settlers. The following year they launched a second raid, this time led by Kuchum's nephew, Mamet Kul. Bruce Lincoln once again speaks on this subject at some length. By the time of Kuchum's first campaign, the Stroganoff's frontier settlements had close to then 1,000 freemen and another 5,000 serfs. As would be the case on the American frontier 100 years later, they had built blockhouses and stockades to protect their homes and fields, and they were well prepared for any attack that might come against them from the east. At first, Kuchum sent his native allies to raid the Stroganoff settlements along the Kama, where in July 1572 they killed nearly 100 Russians. An enraged Tsar Ivan responded by urging the Stroganoffs to live very much on your guard, but to assemble as many men as they could muster to defend their lands against the Tatars. The next year, the Stroganoffs faced a larger Tatar force under the command of Kuchum's nephew that massacred not only Russians but a number of the natives who had joined them. After these raids, the Stroganoffs seemed to get the message and realised that they couldn't expect their people to stay where they were while they were in danger of being raided by their neighbours. So the Tsar granted the Stroganoffs the right to invade Russia, although interestingly he actually rescinded this privilege as he believed that Russia didn't have the men or resources to topple Kuchum's empire. Fearful that larger, better equipped expeditions might soon follow, the Stroganoffs petitioned the Tsar for permission to carry the fighting into the heart of Kuchum's kingdom, rather than continue their defensive war, and their petition reached Moscow not long after Ivan learned that one of his own envoys had been killed by Kuchum's forces. In reply, he extended the Stroganoffs' charters of authority into Siberia itself, and gave them permission to build frontier forts on the edge of Kuchum's land. As the Tsar's agents, the Stroganoffs now had permission to invade Asia. A quarter century of wars and half a lifetime suffering from the pain of spinal disease had eroded the daring that had ruled Ivan the Terrible's decisions in earlier times. Remembering how stubbornly the Tatars had fought his armies at Kazan and in the Crimea, and knowing how wars in the east had drained Russia's resources for almost half a century, the terrible Tsar was by no means confident that the Stroganoffs commanded the manpower and weapons needed to conquer Kuchum's kingdom. Ivan in the late 1570s hesitated to risk opening a second war in the east, knowing that his commanders would continue to call for more men and weapons for the Baltic War than he could supply. He ordered the Stroganoffs to pull back from Siberia. I know that was a really long quote, but I think it adds a lot of important context to the situation. The Stroganoffs decided to just ignore this order of stopping their invasion, and in the late 1570s, Nikita and Maxim Stroganov, Anika Stroganoff's grandsons, recruited Cossacks to wage the war on their behalf. As is Cossack custom, the Cossacks elected their leader, and this leader was Yermak Timofeyevich. Now we can finally talk about Yermak. The only account we have of Yermak's upbringing comes from the Cherapanov Chronicle. This chronicle was compiled in 1760, long after Yermak's death, by a coachman and was never published in full. This seems incredibly unreliable, but in 1894 the historian Alexander Alexeyevich Dmitriev came to the conclusion that it likely represents a copy or paraphrase version of an authentic 17th century document. So while the original document has been lost to us, there is at least some credence behind the Cherapanov Chronicle. It's better than nothing, okay? Terence Armstrong, in his book Yermak's Campaign in Siberia, a selection of documents, gives us the information on Yermak's younger days, so I may as well give you the quote. His grandfather was called Afanasy Grigoryevich Alenin and was from Suzdal, northeast of Moscow. He had two sons, Rodion and Timofey, whose poverty caused them to seek their fortune in the Stroganoff lands of the Tsar River. Rodion had two sons, and Timofey three, Gavrilo, Frol, and Vasily. Vasily was strong and self-confident and worked in the Stroganoff's river fleet on the Kama and Volga. There he gathered a band together, left his employment, and became a river pirate. As leader of the gang, he was called Ataman and acquired the nickname Yermak. Aside from being a river pirate, Yermak also learned war tactics from his time in the Livonian War. Until he entered the service of the Stroganoffs in the spring of 1582, we know only that Yermak had once fought for the Tsar against the armies of Poland, and that, as a brigand of some renown, he had often plundered merchant ships upon which the Tsar had bestowed his protection. And that's it, really. We really don't know anything on Yermak's life before he was hired by the Stroganoffs. Moving on. Yermak was officially enlisted by the Stroganoffs in the spring of 1582, and he was tasked to take de facto possession of the country along the Tobol and the Irtish, which was already de jure in the Stroganoffs' possession under the Tsar's Charter of 1574, with the Stroganoffs' ultimate goal being to open up a southern route to Mangaseya in order to access its furs. Of course, the Khanate of Siberia conveniently blocked the roads from the Urals to Mangaseya. At the start of his expedition, Yermak had 840 men under his control, 540 of which were his own men, and another 300 Russians, Tatars, Lithuanians, and Germans supplied by the Stroganoffs. Despite their small numbers, Nikita Amax and Stroganov spent 20,000 rubles to outfit this group with the best weapons money could buy. This was very advantageous, as the Tatars they would be fighting didn't have access to industrialized weapons. Nikita Amax and Stroganov spent 20,000 rubles, a sum that not even the Tsar could assemble at that moment, to equip and supply Yermak's army with the best weapons that could be found in Russia. Against the bows, arrows, and spears of Kuchum Khan's armies, Yermak's Cossacks therefore carried matchlock muskets, sabres, pikes, and several small cannon. So Yermak set out on the 1st of September 1582, sailing down the Chusovaya River. As you can imagine, while they were sailing down these rivers, they encountered a lot of fierce resistance from Kuchum's native allies. But Yermak's crews were using high-sided boats that originated in Russia, and these high sides acted as shields, allowing Yermak to pass through in relative safety. After 2 months of travel, Yermak's army finally crossed the Urals, and then they followed the Chura River until they found themselves at the outskirts of the Sibir Khanate, Kuchum Khan's empire. A few days later, they reached Kashlik, the capital of the Sibir Khanate and Kuchum's seat of power. This resulted in the Battle of Chuvash Cape on the 23rd of October 1582. Despite the name, this was the battle for Kashlik, but Kuchum isn't stupid and knows that siege would prove fatal for the Tatars, and so decided to fight the battle on the riverbank. The Cossacks approached the bank, firing at the Tatars, and the Tatars answered in kind, although with arrows and not bullets. That being said, the Tatars suffered minimal casualties as they were hidden among the trees along the riverbank. Mehmed Kul, Kuchum's nephew, who had led a raid against Stroganov settlements years before, led a counterattack against the Russians, who formed a square and let their riflemen open fire. It's here that Khanty and Mansi tribesmen that made up a large portion of Kuchum's army panicked and fled. They were mainly hunters who had no experience against soldiers with firearms, but the rest of the Tatars continued their advance. Mehmed Kul was injured during the battle and was evacuated by boat, but his injury and retreat made the rest of his forces retreat, and Kuchum fled Kashlik. The Cossacks had won their first battle, but the losses had been heavy and they chose not to pursue the retreating Tatars. In total, Yermak's forces had been reduced to 500 men, while the Tatars had lost 2,800. It was a crushing blow, but when you have a force as small as Yermak does, every loss hits much harder. Yermak had taken the Khanate of Sibir, but there were few supplies to be found in the city of Kashlik, few supplies they could use anyway. They found silk, fur and gold, but you can't eat these. Although there would be some luck in this area, as the Ostrach people, a native Siberian group, pledged their allegiance to Yermak on October 30th and would demonstrate this by delivering food to Kashlik. This, however, would prove to be too little, forcing the Cossacks to have to venture out into the wilderness to fish and hunt. However, if you remember, Khan Kuchum had survived the battle with Yermak, and as you can imagine, not all of the Siberian natives were thrilled about Yermak's presence, so the Cossacks were under constant attack by Kuchum and his surviving troops, preventing him from truly consolidating control over the Khanate of Sibir. Khan Kuchum had survived the battle for Iska, but he and his troops were forced to abandon the capital and retreat beyond reach of Yermak, who found himself racing ambushes in the taiga. He may have had the county, mansi, and rank of our Tartars lining up to pledge him temporary loyalty, but Yermak also felt the precariousness of his present grandeur. The attacks robbed him of his ability to completely control the region, and as a result many of his troops died of hunger. In one particularly brutal attack, the Tartars ambushed and killed as many as 20 Cossacks. This invoked Yermak's ire, and upon investigation he found that Mehmet Kul had recovered from the wound he suffered at the Battle of Kuvash Cape, and was now directing raids against Yermak. I would tell you how this went, but Frederick Wright gives us a pretty good account of things. In December, a company of 20 were massacred by the Tartars. Upon hearing of it, Yermak at once set out from Siberia to avenge the outrage. When he found that Mehmet Kul had recovered from his wound and was the leader of the attacking party, Yermak was, however, able at this time to inflict upon him so severe a defeat that he suffered no further disturbance during the winter. But in April 1583, Mehmet Kul again approached his ancient capital, though with only a small force, so small indeed that a company of 10 Cossacks took them by surprise, both dispersing them and capturing Mehmet Kul. Mehmet Kul wasn't killed by Yermak though, and he sent a letter to Kuchum to cease the attacks on Yermak and those bringing him tribute, although this appears to have been ignored. The subjugation of Mehmet Kul, however, was a severe blow to Kuchum's remaining power and gave Yermak the breathing room he needed to try and consolidate his power in Siberia. In particular, he had his eyes on the Ostroganoff tribal princes to his south. So Yermak sailed down the Ob and Irtish rivers, and conquest went pretty well, with only 2 princes worth a mention. The first is Prince Demian, who had holed himself up in a fortress on the banks of the Irtish with as many as 2,000 loyal fighters. This fortress took considerable time to break into, but was eventually overcome. The second prince worth a mention is Prince Samar, the most influential of Ostroganoff princes, who joined forces with 8 other princes. However, Samar had made a critical error, and failed to place guards along the perimeter of his encampment. As you can imagine, Yermak took advantage of this and launched a surprise attack, killing Samar and dispersing his forces. After this, 8 other princes all pledged tribute to Yermak, and Yermak himself turned back to Kashlik after capturing Nazim, an important Ostroganoff town, and a few small forts. With his seat of power more secure, Yermak decided now is a good time to report back to the Stroganoffs and Ivan the Terrible. So he sent 2 letters back to Russia, one to the Tsar and the other to the Stroganoffs, as well as a gift of assorted furs to the Tsar. The letters couldn't have arrived at a more opportune moment. If you remember, Yermak's invasion of Siberia was technically illegal. Ivan had revoked the Stroganoffs' rights to invade Asia, remember? Well, this had come to a head back in Russia, and Maxim Stroganov, one of the Stroganoffs who had bankrolled the expedition, had received letters from Ivan denouncing Yermak and threatening him and his followers with death. So this letter was well received. But what about the letter sent to Ivan? Well, when the messenger and letter arrived, Ivan was not in a happy mood. The Livonian War had ended with a Russian defeat, and the Tsar had just received news of raids in Perm. However, after reading of Yermak's conquests, he immediately became overjoyed. He immediately pardoned the Cossacks and proclaimed Yermak to be a hero of the highest order. He then had many gifts prepared to be sent to Yermak, including his own fur mantle, a goblet, 2 suits of armour emblazoned with a bronze double-headed eagles, cold hard cash, and the title of Prince of Siberia. But with the letter delivered with many valuable presents, this speedily allayed the wrath of Ivan and aroused the greatest enthusiasm throughout Moscow. Yermak was at once exalted to the position of a hero of the first degree. The Tsar also arranged for a group of Streltsy, Russian firearm infantry, to be sent to reinforce Yermak, but these would take considerable time to reach him. Now, this whole thing may seem like Yermak is only raising his fortunes, but with a long winter and Kuchum's raids preventing him from gathering food and tribute, and Ivan's reinforcements not arriving for some time, Yermak was left in a rather precarious situation. Then in September 1583, something would force Yermak's hand. He received a call for help from a Tartar leader named Karacha, who was requesting aid against the Nogai Tartars. Yermak was disposed to help Karacha, so he sent 40 Cossacks to sort out the issue, but alas, they were betrayed by Karacha, and they were all killed in an ambush. This was another heavy blow to Yermak, and brought his force down to just 300 men, steadily whittled away by constant raids by Kuchum and his allies. Sensing Yermak's waning power, the tribes that he had managed to subjugate revolted, and Kashlik soon came under siege by a mixed army of Tartars, Volgals, and Asjaks. Although Yermak was able to withstand the siege for 3 months, despite being low on food before the siege even began. Kratcher, however, lured Kolzo into an ambush. Kolzo fell, stabbed with a poniard. Of his 40 Cossacks, only one escaped. It was the worst blow Yermak had suffered in Siberia. He felt now his entire isolation in this measureless, unknown, sinister country. His prestige with the surrounding princes fell. His forces growing steadily less. He had now little more than 300 men. Kratcher was regarded by the Tartars as a hero. He assembled a force of Tartars, Voghals, and Aztecs, surrounded Iska on all sides, and proceeded to blockade the town. The siege lasted nearly 3 months. The Cossacks were on the verge of exhaustion. Every musket loading was counted. Then, one night, when Kratcher had already made preparations for his triumphal entry into Iska, Yermak led out the whole of his Cossacks, threw himself upon Kratcher's forces, and annihilated him. With the siege broken and Kratcher's hosts scattered, Yermak was able to recover substantial supplies from the enemy's camp, although the next day Kratcher launched another attack on Yermak, but this also failed. In disgrace and defeat, Kratcher joined Kuchum on the steppes of the Ishim to the south. Back on top, Yermak decided now was a good time to try and reassert his authority on the surrounding areas. He marched east, conquering many towns and forts, and sailed up the Irtish in the summer of 1584 to subdue tribes and demand tribute. However, his victories weren't without their own issues. By now, Yermak's Cossacks were almost entirely out of gunpowder. He failed to find Kratcher, and although the Tsar's reinforcements had arrived by now, they weren't the boon they had hoped for. When they arrived, they were completely exhausted, riddled with scurvy, and many, including their commanding officer, hadn't survived the journey. Not to mention that the presence of more men just compounded the food issue even more. Eventually the food issue became so dire, the Yermak's men had to resort to cannibalism, eating the bodies of the deceased. Once more the troubled princes rallied to Yermak. They saw that he was invincible. They did not know that in this last struggle the Cossacks had literally shot away the last of their powder. Yermak, however, was finding the situation much too hot for him. Where was the promised voyevode from Moscow? Yermak had now been almost 3 years in Siberia. The land had been conquered, but kept having to be conquered over again. It had submitted to him, but remained alien and unreliable. Not until the spring of 1584 did Bolkowski cross the Urals. He reached Iska without horses, without supplies, with heavy losses of men, and himself seriously ill. He brought powder, but he also brought scurvy. Soon after his arrival, he died of it. Just to clear up confusion, Bolkowski was the leader of the Tsar's reinforcement sent to aid Yermak. The precise details of Yermak's death have been lost to us, but we do have a few variations. The most common is as follows. With the growing food shortages, Kuchum, long content to just be the manipulator and mastermind of many of Yermak's issues, decided now was the time to act in person. Kuchum purposely leaked information to Yermak. The claims were that Bukharan merchants from Central Asia were travelling with large amounts of food and had been prevented from travelling by Kuchum's men. In desperate need of food, Yermak had no choice but to set out with a band of Cossacks to free the traders, although he quickly found out that these claims were false and ordered return back to Kashlik. For an unknown reason, Yermak was forced to stop on a small island formed by 2 branches of the Irtish River and set up camp. Here, Yermak made a tactical error, as believing that the river offered sufficient protection, he didn't post any guards. Kuchum, on the other hand, had been following Yermak's party, and around midnight he forded the river. The Tartars set upon the sleeping Cossacks so quickly that they didn't have time to use their guns or weapons, and it was an absolute slaughter. All but 3 Cossacks were killed, including Yermak, drowned after he attempted to cross the river in his heavy armour, if legend is to be believed. And that's where the story ends, I'm afraid. Yermak is dead, his force reduced to just 150 men who quickly retreat back to Russia after hearing of Yermak's death, and Kashlik was retaken by the Tartars. So, all of that struggle, all of that suffering, but in the end, Siberia was abandoned, Yermak was killed in an average way, and Kashlik was retaken by the enemy. So why do we find the story of Yermak Timofeyevich so intriguing? Well, before I go, I'd like to leave you with 2 quotes. One about Yermak and the other about Kuchum. The first quote is about Kuchum. Something should be said about the adversary, Kuchum. From the chronicles he emerges as a double-dyed villain. It is clear that he is a redoubtable villain. Kuchum, son of Murtaza, the Shaibanid, took the Khanate of Siberia by force in 1563 from the Taibagids, Yedigir, and the Bekbalat. Thereafter he showed great energy, tenacity and determination to resist any Russian advance, a contingency he no doubt foresaw. When it came, he organised a vigorous defence with the small numbers at his disposal, but lost. The Russians, after all, had firearms, and their opponents did not. What impressed the non-partisan reader of the Chronicles, however, is Kuchum's continuing resistance after he had lost his capital and many of his men. The old fox was prowling the steppes and forests, always a threat, and finally, to Yermak, a fatal one. He is a figure worthy of respect, for although he was perhaps little more than a roving brigand who had usurped the throne, nevertheless he strove desperately for 17 years to defend his country against what became hopeless odds. He was taken seriously in Moscow, and exchanged letters with the Tsar, but no historian speaks well of him. The closest thing to an appreciative reference to him is perhaps the Song of Khan Kuchum, one surviving verse of which was discovered among the Siberian Tartars. This is the quote about Yermak. Measured against the great hosts that conquerors from the east had led against the west in earlier times, Yermak's army of 840 men was a tiny force, but it was remarkably similar in size to those European expeditions that carried the great colonial conquests of the New World earlier in that century. Only 88 men had sailed with Columbus to discover the New World, and Hernando Cortez had conquered Mexico's Aztec Empire in 1519 with a force of 617. Like the captains of Spain, Yermak would have the advantage of fighting with firearms against an enemy without them, and the Ural Mountains barrier would cut him off from his bases of supply nearly as completely as the Atlantic Ocean did the expeditions that conquered the New World. As with so many popular heroes, Yermak's power over man grew with the passing of time. For the Russians he became a folk hero, the conqueror of not merely a small Tartar kingdom, but of all Siberia. Over the years, the historical folk songs from which the Russian masses drew comfort during times of oppression transformed this one-time river pirate into a gallant knight, a champion of the unfortunate, and a hero who knew no fear and suffered no reproach. Yermak became Russia's King Arthur, embellished, depending upon the tastes of narrators and listeners, with touches of Roland, Siegfried and Sir Galahad, whenever lonely women and men on the run gathered around Siberian campfires. Among the Tartars, Yermak in death became a brave spirit who could heal the sick and ensure victory to the downtrodden. Tartar legends told how his body had remained uncontaminated for many days after Kuchum's men had pulled it from the river, and how, after they secretly buried their fallen foe on the riverbank, columns of fire visible only to Siberians marked his grave at night. And that's all I have for you today, guys. I'll see you in a few weeks.